Imagine, if you will, two massive stockpiles of the exact same material. We're talking about yellowcake uranium here.
Right, the raw material.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, on one side of the world, I want you to picture a stockpile being signed over in this grand, brightly lit diplomatic hall in New Delhi. I mean, it's for $2.6 billion.
Okay.
You have prime ministers shaking hands, corporate executives, smiling for the cameras. It's just a scene of absolute organized energy security.
Yeah, a very transparent, sovereign-backed transfer of power, basically.
Right. But then picture the second stockpile. 1,000 metric tons of that exact same yellowcake, but it's just sitting on a dusty military tarmac in Africa.
Quite the contrast.
It really is. It's surrounded by armed guards. It's literally fresh off a jihadist attack, and it exists in this state of total geopolitical limbo. It's the exact same chemical makeup, but completely different realities.
And, that stark contrast is really the visual definition of a global market that has just completely fractured in real time.
Welcome to today's Deep Dive. I'm your host, and jumping right in with our resident expert today, we have a really heavy, fascinating stack of sources on the table for you.
Glad to be here. And yeah, we are pulling from some really diverse places today.
We've got corporate press releases from Cameco, some deep background data from the World Nuclear Association, high-level geopolitical briefings, and honestly, some incredibly tense field reports from the Investing News Network and Africa News.
It is a really complex array of information. I mean, jumping from corporate finance to military conflict, but it all points to a single seismic shift in global energy.
It does. And our mission today is to understand how the global nuclear energy map is, well, it's literally splitting in two.
Bifurcating completely.
Right. We're going to look closely at this newly signed $2.6 billion uranium deal between Canada and India, and we're going to contrast it directly with that seized radioactive material currently sitting on a runway in Niger.
Which is just a wild situation.
It is, and if you are listening to this, you really need to care about what is happening here. Whether you're an energy investor tracking commodity cycles or, a geopolitics nerd watching global alliances shift, or honestly, just someone who pays an electricity bill every month and expects the lights to turn on.
Because the fuel that will power the next century is currently being divided along these invisible, highly weaponized political fault lines.
Exactly, and the markets just aren't reflecting it.
No, they aren't. If you are looking solely at the spot price of uranium on a stock ticker, you are completely blind to the real story playing out on the ground.
Because the spot price just tells you what a pound of uranium costs today, right?
Right, exactly. It does not tell you who will actually be permitted to buy it tomorrow. That's the key.
Okay, so to understand the sheer stakes of this divide, we really have to start with the scale of what India is attempting to do here.
Oh, it's staggering.
They've just announced the nuclear energy mission for Viksit Bharat. And the ambition here is, it's almost difficult to comprehend. Right now, India has about 8.8 gigawatts of nuclear capacity, coming from 24 operating reactors.
Yeah.
By 2047, which marks the centenary of their independence, they intend to hit 100 gigawatts.
Which represents an 11-fold expansion of their nuclear fleet in just over 2 decades.
It's eye-watering. They are talking about a $225 billion investment.
Yeah, the capital required is immense.
And to pull this off mechanically, India has to add over 4 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity to their grid every single year.
Which is a pace of heavy infrastructure construction that very few nations in human history have ever achieved, let alone sustained consecutively for 20 years.
Am I kidding?
We aren't talking about throwing up solar panels here. Nuclear provides baseload power.
Right. Let's define baseload for the listener real quick, because we aren't talking about, wind turbines that stop producing when the breeze dies down or solar grids that sleep when the sun sets, are we?
Not at all. Baseload power is the unyielding foundation of an electricity grid.
The heavy lifter.
Exactly. It is the heavy lifting power that must remain constant 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to keep hospital ventilators running, to keep heavy manufacturing plants operating, to power these massive data centers.
You simply cannot run a rapidly industrializing economy of over 1 billion people on intermittent power alone.
No, you need that massive, always-on foundation.
It's like deciding to build the world's biggest fleet of high-performance sports cars, but suddenly realizing you only own one small gas station.
That is a great way to put it.
You have the ambition, you're building the massive engines, but where is the fuel actually coming from?
And that is the critical bottleneck India faces. Because it isn't just about pouring concrete for these new reactors, it is about feeding them.
Right. Now, India does have domestic uranium reserves, don't they?
They do. They have roughly 76,000 tons sitting in the ground.
Wait, 76,000 tons sounds like a literal mountain of uranium to me. If I am an Indian energy minister looking at that domestic stockpile, why am I panicking?
Because of the burn rate required for baseload power.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Those domestic reserves, while they sound vast to a layperson, they can only fuel about 10 gigawatts of capacity for 30 years.
Oh, wow.
So if your sovereign goal is 100 gigawatts, your domestic supply covers barely 25 to 36% of your projected future needs.
So they are going to run out.
It is a mathematical certainty that India will run out of domestic fuel if they scale up their grid as planned.
And they already have 10 new reactors under construction right now, right?
Yeah.
Which represents about 8 gigawatts of new capacity just waiting to be turned on.
Exactly. And to keep the lights on for those 10 new reactors alone, by the early 2030s, India will need to import up to 9,000 metric tons of uranium annually.
Annually. That's huge.
They have no choice but to rely on massive international imports. But in today's highly fractured geopolitical climate, the nation you buy your uranium from is just as important as the physical uranium itself.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this brings us to the historic agreements signed on March 2, 2026 in New Delhi.
The big one.
Yeah. Cameco, which is a Canadian company and one of the largest uranium producers in the entire world, formally agreed to supply India's Department of Atomic Energy.
A massive commitment.
Massive. The contract is for 22 million pounds of uranium ore concentrate, also known as U3O8, to be delivered between 2027 and 2035. And the deal is valued at roughly 2.6 billion Canadian dollars.
Yeah, let's get technical for a second about what they actually bought. We often hear uranium and just picture like a glowing green rod from The Simpsons.
Right, totally. But what actually is U3O8?
Well, U3O8 is yellow cake. It is a dense, mildly radioactive powder.
Okay.
It is essentially the raw flour you need to bake the bread, but it is not the finished bread yet. You still have to put that powder through a really complex supply chain to convert it into a gas, enrich it, and finally fabricate it into the fuel assemblies that actually go into a reactor core.
So when India signs a multi-billion-dollar deal for this raw material with Canada, they're basically securing the very beginning of a highly complex, decade-long supply chain.
Precisely.
But wait, looking at the recent history between these two countries, this feels like absolute geopolitical whiplash to me.
It really does.
I mean, just 3 years ago, in 2023, Canada and India suffered a total diplomatic collapse.
Over the incident in British Columbia, yeah.
Right, over the assassination of a Sikh separatist. And just to be clear with our listeners, we are just looking at the facts of the fallout here. The Canadian government alleged Indian involvement. The Indian government strongly denied the allegations. And the immediate result was just a diplomatic deep freeze.
Absolute standstill.
Embassies were cleared out, visas were halted, trade talks completely stalled. I mean, how on earth do we get from that deep freeze to the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, and the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, standing in the same room signing a multi-billion-dollar nuclear pact?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
what we are witnessing is the reality that fundamental sovereign fuel security completely trumps temporary political friction.
Energy comes first.
Always.
Right.
India actually held a previous supply contract with Cameco from 2015 to 2020.
Right.
That contract naturally expired and was not immediately renewed, and that was heavily influenced by those deteriorating political relations at the time.
So they were basically willing to walk away when the stakes were lower.
Exactly. But as India finalized this staggering 100-gigawatt goal, the harsh reality of their domestic shortfall set in. The math became undeniable.
You can't run a reactor on diplomatic grudges.
You really can't. They realized they simply could not afford to be picky or hold grudges over their literal energy survival. And looking at the Canadian side, I mean, the commercial opportunity of powering the world's fastest-growing major economy was just far too massive to ignore.
And the guest list at the signing ceremony tells the whole story, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
It wasn't just low-level corporate executives quietly signing papers in a back room somewhere. You had both prime ministers present. You had Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, representing the province where the uranium is actually mined, standing right alongside Cameco CEO Tim Gitzel.
And that specific lineup of political and corporate heavyweights is a loud signal to the global market.
What's the signal?
It highlights that this is a sovereign-backed long-term alignment. It goes far beyond just a one-off corporate transaction. It is two distinct nations legally and physically binding their energy infrastructure together.
Which fundamentally rewires the global supply map as we know it. I mean, historically, India has relied heavily on the Eastern Bloc for its nuclear fuel, right?
Yeah.
They bought extensively from Russia's state-owned Rosatom. They bought from Uzbekistan's Navoy and from Kazakhstan's Kazatomprom. And all of those entities sit firmly within or adjacent to the Russian supply chain influence.
Which was an arrangement that provided India with a comfortable, reliable pipeline of fuel for many years.
But here's where it gets really interesting. This new 22 million pound deal completely changes their underlying math.
Totally flips it.
It elevates Canada to become India's single largest committed uranium supplier for the next 9 years. It is actively, deliberately squeezing out Russia's traditional role in powering the Indian subcontinent.
Because India isn't just buying fuel here, they are making the profound strategic choice.
They are actively locking themselves into the Western supply chain.
Yes, and we're watching the real-time bifurcation of the global nuclear fuel market into two highly distinct, highly politicized ecosystems. On one side, the Western sphere, you have highly organized, legally transparent, long-term contracts. You have Western suppliers like Canada and Australia, aligning with developing powerhouses like India, who require stable, predictable growth to survive.
It is a market governed by lawyers, international trade agreements, and predictable delivery schedules.
Exactly. But the global appetite for energy isn't shrinking. If you are a nation that is frozen out of these billion-dollar Canadian contracts, where do you go?
You go looking for the supply that has fallen off the books.
Right.
Which takes us to our second stockpile and a very different kind of reality. Because while those diplomats in suits are shaking hands and taking flash photos in New Delhi, there are 1,000 metric tons of seized yellowcake uranium sitting on the tarmac at a military airbase near Niamey, Niger.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer velocity of how quickly this resource was weaponized by the local government.
It happened so fast.
To understand how 1,000 tons of nuclear fuel ended up stranded on a runway, you have to look at the military junta that seized power in Niger in 2023. They essentially ripped up the international rulebook.
Yeah, they did.
They formally nationalized the Somai mine, and they violently stripped all operational control away from Orano, which is a French state-owned nuclear company that had operated in that region for decades.
But wait, there are international laws against a government just seizing foreign corporate assets, aren't there? I mean, you can't just take a uranium mine.
Well, you are supposed to be bound by international law. The International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, or ICSID, which is a tribunal backed by the World Bank.
Okay.
They ruled explicitly in September that any sale of the seized uranium by Niger is entirely illegal. Legally speaking, that yellowcake still belongs to the French company Orano.
But a tribunal sitting in an office in Washington, D.C. doesn't have an army to enforce its rulings in the Sahara Desert.
Exactly, and that is the crucial mechanism of modern geopolitics. Legal ownership means very little if you lack physical control of the asset.
Yeah.
Niger's mining minister, Colonel Ousmane Barki, he operates under the assumption that physical possession is all that matters. He has openly stated to the press that they are actively in talks with Russia, and they are in talks with China to sell this exact legally contested stockpile.
I want you listening at home to just picture the extreme contrast here for a second. That airbase in Niamey, holding the 1,000 tons of uranium. In January 2026, literally just weeks before the pristine Canada-India deal was signed, that military base was attacked by Islamic State militants.
A direct, violent assault.
On a facility housing a massive quantity of nuclear material.
It's an incredibly dangerous scenario that really illustrates the physical volatility of this side of the market.
And according to the field reports we pulled, that jihadist attack was repelled in part by Russian military forces who are now permanently stationed in Niger after the junta expelled the French military presence.
The shift in military power perfectly mirrors the shift in the commodity market.
So look at the two sides of the coin that power our world. You have Western uranium flowing smoothly, securely, and legally across oceans to India. Meanwhile, African uranium is drifting east, held hostage under the shadow of extremist violence, and heavily guarded by a Russian military presence.
And this specific dichotomy is why looking only at the spot price is so dangerous for any investor or energy analyst right now.
How so?
While the spot price of uranium recently hovered around $89 a pound, even briefly spiking past $100, but that single financial number treats all physical uranium as if it is completely equal.
It assumes a pound of powder is a pound of powder.
Right. It prices a pound of uranium safely mined in Saskatchewan exactly the same as a pound of uranium sitting on a contested, bullet-riddled military runway in Niger.
Which is insane when you think about it.
The spot price completely fails to calculate the geopolitical risk premium. Think about the mechanisms of international trade. If you are a Western utility company needing fuel to keep a city's lights on, you cannot touch that Nigerian uranium no matter how steeply discounted it gets.
Yeah, because of the legal fallout.
Buying it would expose your company to massive international lawsuits from Orano, severe reputational ruin, and frankly, the physical risk of relying on a supply chain guarded by Russian mercenaries.
Right.
The global market has hard-forked into a safe Western supply and a contested Eastern supply. As nations like India aggressively lock up the safe supply, the desperate scramble for whatever is left over is going to become intensely volatile.
Okay, but this brings up a massive historical contradiction that I want to ask you about.
Sure.
If India is so eager to align their future with the West, and they're willingly spending billions on Canadian fuel right now, why haven't Western companies like Westinghouse or GE Hitachi been building reactors in India for the last decade?
That is the big question.
Because I remember they signed that landmark U.S.-India 123 agreement way back in 2008. It was supposed to trigger this massive nuclear renaissance in India fueled by American technology, but it completely stalled out. No shovels hit the dirt. So what does this all mean?
To understand why the Western tech didn't flow into India earlier, we have to look closely at the legal architecture that governs global nuclear power.
Okay.
The reason major Western reactor builders stayed out of the Indian market for so long really comes down to the mechanism of a single piece of legislation.
What was it?
India's 2010 Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act.
A liability law held up hundreds of billions in infrastructure.
It did because of how it assigned blame. In the global nuclear industry, there is a universally accepted standard principle called operator liability.
That means what?
The mechanism is simple. If something goes wrong at a nuclear plant, the utility company operating the plant pays the damages. The liability is strictly channeled to the operator.
Makes sense.
But India's 2010 law deviated from this international norm in a way that just terrified foreign vendors. It included a unique clause that allowed the Indian operator to legally sue the foreign suppliers.
The companies that merely manufactured the parts.
Exactly. For up to 80 years after the reactor was built, if a latent defect caused an accident.
I want to make sure the listener grasps how wild that is. Imagine if you bought a car and 30 years later the brakes failed, and under the law, you were legally allowed to sue the grandson of the factory worker in another country who originally installed the brake pad.
That is a perfect analogy. That is essentially the level of open-ended liability India was threatening foreign nuclear companies with.
So obviously they all walked away.
It was an uninsurable risk. No Western company, no matter how large, could secure corporate insurance for 80 years of open-ended cross-border liability. So despite all the glowing diplomatic agreements signed by politicians, the actual physical construction of Western reactors in India completely froze.
The supply chain mechanism was legally broken.
Exactly. But the landscape shifted recently.
Dramatically.
Yeah, in December 2025, just 3 months before the Cameco fuel deal was finalized, the Indian Parliament passed the Shanti Bill,
which stands for Sustainable Harnessing and Advancement of Nuclear Energy for Transforming India.
Right, and the legislative impact of the Shanti Bill was the missing piece of the puzzle.
It completely repealed those old restrictive liability acts, didn't it?
It legally dismantled the roadblock. The Shanti Bill finally aligned India's domestic legal framework with standard international norms. That 80-year supplier liability threat was entirely erased from the books.
Wow.
By fixing that underlying legal mechanism, India officially opened the floodgates. This new legal environment allows for foreign technology to enter the country safely. It allows massive private sector funding to finally flow into Indian nuclear projects.
And crucially, it paves the way for the development of their indigenous small modular reactors, known as the Bharat small reactors, right?
Yes, which they plan to build in deep partnership with private Western industry now that the legal hurdles are gone.
So it's this beautifully orchestrated 1-2 punch. First, they passed the Shanti Bill in December 2025 to rewrite their sovereign laws so Western technology companies will actually work with them. And then literally 3 months later, in March 2026, they signed a $2.6 billion deal with Canada to ensure they have the physical fuel required to run all the new technology they're about to import and build.
India didn't just buy Western fuel, they literally rewrote their own national laws to integrate completely with the Western technological ecosystem.
It is a total strategic pivot, executed on both a legal and a physical level.
Unprecedented scale, really.
Let's bring this all together for you listening at home. The $2.6 billion Cameco India deal is not just another massive corporate energy transaction. It is a loud, undeniable geopolitical declaration.
Absolutely.
As India races toward this unbelievable goal of 100 gigawatts of nuclear power by 2047, it has firmly, legally, and financially anchored its entire grid to the Western supply chain. And by doing so, they are leaving the contested high-risk resources.
Like those 1,000 tons of yellowcake currently sitting on a jihadist-threatened runway in Niger.
Exactly, they're leaving that to the Eastern Bloc. The global map of nuclear energy hasn't just shifted, it has been permanently redrawn.
It has. And, this raises an important question, and it is a paradigm I want everyone to consider as we close out this deep dive today.
Let's hear it.
We have spent this time analyzing how the physical uranium market has fractured into two highly politicized ecosystems, one Western, one Eastern. But if this divide continues to deepen, how long until we see a dual pricing system emerge in the global financial market?
Oh, wow. A fractured spot price.
Exactly. It's the natural progression. What happens when there is no longer a single global price for uranium? Imagine a future where we have a Western spot price traded in US dollars, representing legally secure, transparent fuel, and running parallel to it, a totally separate Eastern spot price traded in rubles or yuan, representing the contested, high-risk fuel sourced from unstable regions. If the physical fuel is divided by geopolitical borders, the financial mechanisms used to value that fuel will inevitably split as well.
Meaning the cost of powering a nation won't just depend on supply and demand anymore.
No, it will depend on entirely separate financial realities dictating what currency your energy survival is priced in.
A massive shift for the global economy, something to definitely keep an eye on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible forces powering our world, and we'll catch you next time.